Today I would like to cover 8 different topics. The first one is going to be an introduction into the whole idea of what is sports law. I'm assuming we have sports fans here. I see a Red Sox hat in front. I'm sorry. And I see in the back row we have a Michigan shirt. Congratulations on the win over Notre Dame. So once we discuss what is sports law, then we are going to discuss internal regulation of professional sports. Now, for purposes of the entire lecture today, it would just take us days upon weeks upon years to discuss everything in sport. So I'm going to limit the conversation to professional sports and the implications of professional sport law. Then we are going to discuss constructing a player's market, and we're going to look at issues that involve players and contracts. The kind of issues that when people ask me, Mark, you practice sports law, don't you work in contracts? And the response will be, yes, it's part of what I do, but not all of what I do. So that will be the third step, that part, the issues related to contracts. The fourth mini-lecture will be an introduction to antitrust law and the way that antitrust relates to sport, which interestingly goes to the answer that I give most people when they ask me, Mark, isn't the job of being a lawyer in sports about contracts? And my response is, no, it involves contracts, but first and foremost, it involves antitrust, and to a lesser extent, labor. Then I'm going to give an introduction into single-entity sports leagues, which are leagues that are constructed in such a way such that they avoid having to comply with antitrust law. Then we'll be looking at eligibility restrictions in professional sport, and namely, I will take you into the case of Ohio State former running back Maurice Clarett. The seventh part of this lecture will be discussing baseball's antitrust exemption, and then we will close by looking at global issues and the way that global issues affect professional sport. One more time, just by a show of hands, how many people here are sport fans? That's great. I will try my best throughout this lecture to make sure that the basic terms of sport are understood to those of you that do not follow the games. I will save time for questions at the end, so please feel free to ask anything that comes to your head that you may not have picked up on from the lecture at hand. Before we begin, I would like to give just one disclaimer. The ideas presented in this presentation are not those of the firm at which I work, Dewey Ballantine. They are rather ideas being presented solely by myself for the purpose of education and getting to learn about sports law. I hope you enjoy. What is sports law? The words mean a lot of things to different people, and to some, the term sports law means nothing at all. Let's take a look at how that definition of sport law has been applied doctrinally by students and professors over the years. One of the first mentions of sports law, just out of curiosity, did anybody here go to the University of Pennsylvania Law School? Any of you on law review at the University of Pennsylvania? Back in 1975, in the back of an edition of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, there was an article that was not referred to as an article or a note or a comment. It was just called an aside. And the title of it was The Common Law Origins of the Infield Fly Rule. Anybody that knows baseball would know that the infield fly rule means that when there's runners on first and second base, or first, second, and third, if there is a pop fly ball hit to the infield, the batter is automatically out, and the runners could advance at their own pace. Now, someone would ask, why is a runner automatically out? Why is the batter automatically out on a pop fly ball? And the rationale was there were players that were intentionally dropping the ball to confuse the runner and get multiple outs. So, in the legacy of baseball, the rules just changed in themselves upon rulings of commissioners. So the common law origins of the infield fly rule talks about how the rules changed in baseball, much as common law is developed in the legal system. Interestingly, at the University of Michigan Law School in 2001, Professor Sherman Clark, known as an expert in the field of evidence and torts, gave a seminar for credit called The Rules of Sport. The entire course just looked at how the rules developed in different sports leagues and related them to how rules develop in our legal system. So that's one view of sport law, looking at how rules of individual games develop, and then linking that how do rules apply in our legal system. Another way of looking at sports law is looking at the various people, the various lawyers that have had a profound effect on sports over the years. And what might be to some surprise, sports and the history of sports is very much intertwined with lawyers and the acts that lawyers have performed. And there's some very colorful characters. Anybody here from Columbia Law School? Well, Columbia had its own character, John Montgomery Ward, Monty Ward. He actually was a player who was creative enough to stop dropping fly balls that led to the creation of the infield fly rule. Well, in 1890, John Montgomery Ward formed a players' league in sports, where the owners were the players themselves. And as a player, he used his knowledge of the law to improve the players' bargaining position. Unfortunately for Ward, the league was defunct within a year when the players did not have money to maintain the league, and they were bought out by the more established leagues. You have Oliver Wendell Holmes, a very famous justice who issued the federal baseball opinion, one of the most well-known opinions in sport that gave baseball its antitrust exemption, to the extent it still exists. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a former judge who became the first commissioner of baseball. You have Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who helped integrate the game by signing Jackie Robinson. He too was a lawyer, having graduated from Michigan Law School. We have Tony La Russa, the manager, who you often see yelling and arguing with umpires at the game. He too is a lawyer. At one point, he might have been yelling and arguing with judges. We also have John Dowd. John Dowd was the person who was responsible for investigating Pete Rose. He was hired by Bart Giamatti to look into gambling in baseball. He, being an investigator, once again, was a lawyer. Sports law covers many different topics. It's contracts, antitrust, labor, intellectual property, and torts. But even with all of this said, some people question whether a discipline called sport law even exists. Again, by a show of hands, how many of you took the course sports law while you were in law school? Oh, wow. Gary Wheeler and Paul Roberts are the authors of the leading textbook called Sports and the Law. Neither of them were willing to call the textbook sports law, and even the two people who build their career teaching in that discipline question whether the discipline is even real. Quoting directly from their textbook, Wheeler and Roberts say sports law represents nothing more than an amalgamation of various substantive areas of the law that are relevant in the sports context. The term sports law is a misnomer. A misnomer. Given that sports represents a form of activity and entertainment governed by the legal system in its entirety. So even the authors of the textbook, Sports and the Law, would be looking and saying, what is Edelman doing up here teaching about something that does not exist? You learn sports law from learning the other substantive topics. Yet that view is not agreed by everyone. In fact, Simon Gardner, the leading practitioner of sport law in Europe, takes a completely different view, as do I. My take is to some extent, indeed, Wheeler and Roberts are right. Sports law analyzes how professional and amateur sports are regulated, both internally and externally. But the central tenet of sports law is that society needs to strike a balance. Society needs to strike a balance between sports' desire for self-regulation and the government's need for oversight. Think about this for a second. To To what extent should sports be regulated by the commissioners and teams themselves? And to what extent should our government, our Congress, our judges be engaged